Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from the Cybersecurity Collaborative. We will get started in just a minute. We are just waiting for people to log into today's CRI open webinar about protecting your data from USBs and other dangers. We will just wait for a few minutes for people to log in, and then we will get going. Thank you for attending today's session. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from the Cybersecurity Collaborative. I want to thank you for joining our co-branded session with CRI, specifically around protect your data from USBs and other dangers. We have done 4 of these sessions as a champion of the CRI program. We are interested in helping, educate and support and advise the CRI users and people interested in the downloads of the CRI tools. We are fortunate enough to have Kirsten Todd with us, the Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute, to give you an update on CRI and where things are, the 4 pillars and what they've identified from their initial research and the open source tools that they've rolled out. And with Rich Mason, who's the former CSO and CISO at Honeywell, he is on our leadership board. He has been a tremendous asset to the Cyber Security Collaborative, and he'll be giving us his perspective on protecting your data from USBs, as from not only a large company perspective, but also we'll ask him to put his hat on if he was a sole security practitioner, managing an organization, what would he do and how would he educate people? What would he tell them to be ready for? So with that, I want to remind everybody, we will have a question and answer period about 40 minutes after the hour. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box or the question box. We'll do our best to get to every single one of those. We will also have a written summary that will be made available probably by the middle of next week. That'll be available both on our website as well as CRI will have it available for them to distribute through their network as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining today's session, and I will turn it over to Kirsten Todd, the Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute.
Thanks very much, Stuart, and thanks very much to you and the Cybersecurity Collaborative. As you mentioned, this is our 4th in a series of 4, and you've been a tremendous champion for our efforts, which really is about educating small businesses on cyber readiness, as well as working with large companies on helping them to secure their value chain. So everything you've done is sort of the template for how to do this and do it well, and we're very grateful for your partnership. I'll go to the first slide and tell you a little bit about the Cyber Readiness Institute. So the Cyber Readiness Institute was created and I'm sorry, we'll go to the next slide. The Cyber Readiness Institute was created as an organization following the Presidential Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. And the objective was to focus on one issue. And if we could go to the next slide on the mission, please. And the objective was to look at how do we convene global leaders across the country and across the world to help them inform the development of free tools and resources for small businesses in an effort to secure global value chains. And what we were looking to do here was to engage senior leadership of companies and bring them together to identify and recognize the importance of supporting small businesses. And we'll go to the next slide, please. And Stephen, I just want to make sure you and I are on the same page. I can move ahead. Yep, so and now we'll go to the next slide, please. And so what we've done is we've engaged these global companies, MasterCard, Microsoft, the Center for Global Enterprise, which is a nonprofit that was started by Sam Palmisano, the retired CEO of IBM, and PSP Partners, which Penny Pritzker is chair of. She's the former Secretary of Commerce. These 4 founding co-chairs had a role in the commission. And then since our launch, we've brought on ExxonMobil, Maersk, General Motors, to name a few. And what we're looking to do is to bring their expertise to inform this distinct discipline of small businesses. Because what we've learned over time is that with the interdependencies that are created in this world and in this reality, it really means that everybody and every business is connected in a way that requires and demands that we have a baseline level of security. To the age-old adage around we're only as strong as our weakest link, we need to make sure that our weakest link has a baseline level of security that can function. And we'll go to the next slide, please. I can talk a little bit, but Stephen, if you're able to move it to the next slide, that would be great. What we've done is we've created a network of champions, and I referenced this earlier around how with the Cybersecurity Collaborative. And this network of champions is how we've engaged global businesses worldwide. And so we have over 60 organizations with which we've partnered. And the objective here is to create a network that touches millions of small businesses. And our objective for this year of 2019 was to reach over 1 million small businesses. And we have just hit that with the addition of some international partners. And what we look to do is we spent the first year of the Cyber Readiness Institute creating a program called the Cyber Readiness Program. And our objective was to look at issues that really focus on human behavior. So Stuart referenced earlier the 4 pillars. And what we have focused on is passwords and authentication, patching, phishing, and USB use. And the webinars that we've conducted with the Cybersecurity Collaborative have focused on each of these. And as you all know, today we're focusing on USB use. And our approach is really to provide guidance and tools on preventative measures, so focusing on what you can prevent, but then also looking specifically at when something does happen, what's effective incident response. What we have learned over the years in this space is that a breach does not have to be a demonstration of failure. How you respond is really a measure of success. And so what we're looking to do with the Cyber Readiness Institute for small businesses is by focusing on a workforce, by focusing on human behavior, preventing what you can, but then also being prepared to respond when something happens. And we do this by creating a cyber readiness culture, which really emphasizes the personal responsibility and accountability of each employee. As cybersecurity, as you all know, is no longer something that resides within an IT department. Every individual has an impact on cybersecurity. We all have a phone. We all use our laptops. Arguably, I don't think it's an argument anymore. We contain more information on our smartphones than on any other device in the history of the world when you think about everything that you're connected to and you're engaged with. And so when we look at our workforce, there is the need to educate each employee on how they're touching their own supply chain, which can then actually impact the security of the organization. So we focus on reducing cyber risk in practical ways, helping companies prioritize their mission, understanding which assets are most critical, and being able to do this through a 5-step self-guided program. This slide reflects the members and the champions that I referenced earlier. And we'll go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, what we do is we focus on these 4 issues, the phishing, patching, USB use, and passwords and authentication. And what we're looking to do, as I referenced earlier, is these are issues that when you walk up to a person, everybody has a contact with. These are issues that really the solution lies in human behavior. And that's, again, in creating these cultures of cyber readiness, that's what we're focused on. If we could go to the next slide, please. And I'll jump ahead to where we are with USB use. So the next slide, please, Stephen. Thank you. What we've done in this program is we've created template policies that focus on how you can encourage and support each individual within your workforce. And these are the definitions, obviously, of the 4 issues. Today, as you all know, we're focusing on USBs and how they work. And so everyone has a baseline level of understanding probably about USB attacks, but a USB attack is really opportunistic. Hackers will infect USBs with malicious software, such as viruses, spyware, rootware, and others. And the attacks rely on human behavior because in most cases, providers of USBs don't know if it's been infected, and many people will use them, as we all know. For a long time, we'd go to conferences and it's what's handed out, but you don't know what's been put on them, and they're a very easy way to infect. And so one of the things that we talk about is creating policies, and I'll get to this in a moment, that can either be rigid or can also create some adaptation. So USBs are common in work environments, but if your employees are using them without proper inspection and monitoring, it obviously puts your organization at great risk. And so the need to have a strong policy becomes very important. And again, what we're focusing on is essentially education. So if we could go to the next slide. One of the things that we talk about throughout the cyber readiness program, and I'll go to that in a moment, are 3 ways to develop policies for USB. So first, develop the policy. Control the use of USBs in your organization by developing this policy. You can either prohibit USB use altogether, or at a minimum, restrict and monitor its use. And then educate your employees. And this is just a fundamental principle to the program across the board. Educating the employees around USBs, the recognition that just because you get something in at a conference doesn't mean that it's been invalidated and can be used. And then importantly, because particularly for small businesses, it's important to provide alternatives. You don't want a culture that creates a lot of security workarounds. So if USBs are critical to how you're functioning because of a mobile workforce, define appropriate alternatives so that the storing and the transporting and the sharing of information in your organization is reasonable. And sometimes that means just providing vetted USB devices or looking at other policies. And I'll talk a little bit now about the program. So if we could go to the next slide. As I mentioned, we began in 2017 and we spent the first year focusing on the development of the Cyber Readiness Program. And the program focuses on 5 stages. And what the core of the program is identifying an individual within a small business that can take on this effort. And we call it a cyber readiness leader. And this isn't somebody who should be housed in the IT department. It's somebody who really has high emotional intelligence and can create that culture of security and knows how to impact change within a culture, within that culture, and to affect use. The second stage is about assessing and prioritizing the key assets to the small business. We also provide background on the 4 issues, but really guide the company toward prioritizing what to protect. We also have guidance on what to move to the cloud and when, and establishing some qualitative baseline metrics. In the third stage, we provide information on the policy templates, which I referenced earlier, and then give some guidance on how to customize them for the organization and provide guidance on developing an incident response plan. One of the key elements to an incident response plan, particularly as we're looking at these 4 issues, is also the exercising of it, understanding how you can access that plan, how it's being used as a company changes, particularly small businesses with the environments changing. It's all the more important to make sure it's current and it's being used. And then we walk the business through the rollout, how to introduce the program to your workforce. We provide a lot of collateral materials, training and communications. And then in the final stage, it's another metric for success. We ask the same qualitative metrics in stage 2 and stage 5. And then once a company completes this program, they get a cyber readiness certificate to explain that they have taken the efforts, that they've gone through this whole program. And the intent here is to give a notification to their supply chains that they understand the importance of bringing cybersecurity into their organization, and not just as a technology, but as a human behavior, as a cultural piece. Cybersecurity is not a one-time event. It's a series of ingrained behaviors that you enforce over time. And one of the things that we talk a lot about with technology and human behavior is that it is not one or the other. Effective and secure human behavior can be a force multiplier for technology. And that becomes very critical as we look at the evolving threat and what happens. And The final point that I'll make about cybersecurity as we're looking at small businesses is we focus a lot on resilience. And resilience is about creating an infrastructure that when something does happen, you minimize disruption. You contain the disruption, you minimize the disruption to operations. In some cases, hopefully it's not interrupted at all. But what we really have to be focusing on is we're not looking to rebuild to what we had. Resiliency is about when something happens, rebuilding to the future and allowing events and things that happen to a business to not take it down, but actually to inform the security in the future. When we look at hurricanes, often we look as a sign of success to rebuild what was once before. But when you start talking to scientists and urban developers, what we should be doing post-hurricane is not rebuilding to what once was, because that got destroyed. We want to rebuild to where we're anticipating the threats to be. And so that physical example really applies in cybersecurity. We have the ability to take threats, to take actions and events that have harmed us and actually bring them in as education and rebuild to the future. And for small businesses, that's particularly important. And you can rebuild much more effectively when you're rebuilding to the future and you're rebuilding with a culture of security and a culture of readiness. If we go to the next slide, it's the final slide. It has our website on it, cyberreadinessinstitute.org. This program is free. If you go to the upper right-hand corner of the website, you can sign up and it walks you through each of the stages that I provided an overview for. But as we look at this particular issue of USB use, the key element that we focus on with the Cyber Readiness Institute is really focusing on the human behavior and the education piece, and educating your employees to do what's right and to be aware of where the threats lie. Thanks for the opportunity to present. I'm now going to introduce my colleague, Rich Mason, the former CSO and CISO of Honeywell, and he's going to talk about his experience, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Rich, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kirsten. Pleasure to be here, folks. My name is Rich Mason. As mentioned, I'm the former CSO and Chief Information Security Officer at Honeywell. Spent 2002 through 2015 there, in the last 10 years, leading the cyber and physical security organizations. If we could skip to my first slide, please, that would be great. And I think it's important that we look at how the organization was structured, because Honeywell looked at the threat as a converged threat. So organizationally, we converge physical and cybersecurity under a single roof as well. I think for the very reason that we're discussing USB today. Again, those threats are converged. We're even calling them now this class of attacks as a cyber physical attack, and USB falls into that. Not just on the malware side, but also when you consider the threat of the insider, which is a cyber physical threat, whether that's a well-meaning insider or a malicious actor insider, both falling into that category. And as Kirsten mentioned, social engineering is a very prevalent threat that I would also consider to be a converged cyber physical threat as well. So looking at those things organizationally, making sure that we're not myopic in how we approach threats, but we look at all of those dimensions, cyber, physical, and certainly how we are a key element of business operations, not a standalone silo, but a built-in horizontal versus a vertical. Next slide, please. When I started thinking about USB for the context of this presentation, I thought the most beneficial framework for the attendees would be looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. If we could go to the next slide. There we go. Thank you very much. And if you're not familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I would strongly recommend taking a look at it. What it ultimately does, very much like a kill chain that was developed by Lockheed Martin. It takes that approach of all the steps involved in an attack, but in the MITRE model, much more granular in terms of the techniques that are used within each of those key tactics, all the way from initial access through execution, persistence, lateral movement, collection, command and control, and exfiltration. It's interesting to see USB playing a role in each of those verticals, and it's not surprising. Because USB is so pervasive. It's a a 23-year-old standard now, and that standard is completely backwards compatible, all the way back to what I would describe as the pre-security era, when people assume that everything that's connected to everything else is done so for trusted reasons, and trust is simply assumed. And again, we're not just talking about thumb drives. We're talking within the USB standard. We're talking about anything that can talk over that bus. We're talking about thumb drives, cables, speakers, mice, phones, essentially anything that can communicate over that bus now represents a vector for attack. When you look within the MITRE ATT&CK framework, especially in that initial access realm, you see that there's categories such as adversary introduces accessories. We'll go into an example of Hack5's Rubber Ducky and the whole bad USB suite of threats that are out there today. You can see that there's supply chain compromises. Catching the media attention lately was Supermicro. Whether that turned out to be true or not is a matter of debate, but not debated were the supply chain compromises for IBM with their Storewise malware built into their Storewise solution, and the Schneider Electric Connex and Combox compromise. So even our trusted suppliers, or who we perceive to be trusted suppliers, can sometimes be a threat to us as well. So that's from inbound to everything in between to outbound. 25% of the malware attacks that are surfaced today, according to US CERT at least, are manifested through USB. But that's just the malware space. And I think when we talk about USB, we're talking well beyond malware. We're talking about malicious acts where there's no residue of code left behind. You can ultimately convert a USB into being processed as a human interface device, where the machine thinks it's a keyboard, it's a mouse, and you can do all sorts of insertions of malicious scripts into those things that are in no way left on the system as a piece of malware. So very careful controls need to be crafted to be in order to defend against those things. We can go to the next slide. So the Ben Gurion University of the Negev out of Israel has done some really powerful research in this space, and they looked at all the malware that was available to them when they did the study. I believe it was in 2018. They found 29 different families of malware. And I thought it was interesting how they broke these down into 4 discrete categories. Now, the first one is programmable peripherals. And essentially, I will call this, for simplicity's sake, the make one category. You're seeing this with the bad USB cables that are out there. You're seeing this with the Rubber Ducky devices that are out there. A good colleague of mine over at Honeywell has crafted what is now called a Vapinator. So Eric Knapp presented this at RSA earlier this year, but essentially, between some 3D printing and some handcrafting, was able to create a working vape. He used it in a conference, had no tobacco in it, so it was largely showmanship. But as he plugged that into the device he was presenting with, having obviously a crash and a malicious action occur right on his presentation machine, was pretty cool from an effect perspective. But I call that category the make one, where people are building now custom built malicious devices to attack your enterprise. You can also have a hack one, where there is firmware on board a USB device, and people are able to actually compromise that firmware with their own custom firmware. There's an upgrade functionality called DFU, or device firmware upgrade functionality, that can allow someone to attempting to do a trusted update, but could also use that same channel to provide an untrusted update as well. So the hack one category, using modified USB firmware. There's a third category of normal functionality. If we go back to the days of Stuxnet, which I think is a ways back now, but 2010, and this is going after operational technology, those key industrial process controls. In some cases, state-sponsored attacks going after things like uranium centrifuges. But the normal functionality of how a link file was processed by Windows systems could cause a buffer overflow and a compromise of those devices. Normal functionality would include auto run. And so I remember back to my Bell Labs days as a former forensic investigator, going after Windows 9X, 95 and 98 machines, and we were able to simply build a CD-ROM that we put into someone's machine with an auto run script on it, and that auto run would fire even when the machine was locked and would kill the process of their screensaver, and you'd be into the machine. So a very simple compromise, but we see those same very attacks now in still taking out Macs, unfortunately, and doing so through USB as a threat vehicle. The other normal functionality would be using USB as a cold boot attack. So normal functionality says you can set the machine to boot to USB first. If you do that quickly, you can boot to a malicious USB and still harvest some residue of memory where there may be things like encrypted keys and other useful information that a hacker could use against production. Again, all normal functionality. The final category is the electrical attack, perhaps one to worry less about, but people building custom devices, you could put capacitors on board that's harvesting power directly from the asset itself over USB, charging it up over capacitor, and then sending it back down those channels to ultimately fry the electronics behind it. Having someone unintentionally or unwittingly plug one of those devices into a production environment, particularly operational technology, can take down production, and in some cases, a simple restart of production costs millions of dollars. Next slide. So just a couple of examples of things that you can find commercially available. Looking at Rubber Ducky as one. Again, because it's a hid device, it's able to impersonate other devices. And the underlying problem with the whole USB standard is that the host controller asks the device controller what it is and how it should act. That's a level of trust that many of us are not comfortable with nowadays. We would want some independent attestation that this is really a trusted device instead of just asking it how we should trust it. But you see Rubber Ducky being able to, as it's plugged in, injecting malicious keystrokes, installing backdoors, exfilling documents, stealing passwords, and any other custom script that you could imagine, even if the PC is actually locked. Next slide. Recommend taking a look at the bad USB series. There's a lot of folks trying to outdo one another. In the latest example that I've seen, this is the USB Ninja cable. They've added wireless remote control triggers so that the payload can be remotely triggered to fire. Again, bad USB using that same hit attack, emulating keyboards and mice, but also now emulating a network card. And by emulating a network card, you're able to modify DNS settings so that you could do a man in the middle via DNS, or just wholly redirecting traffic through an unauthorized proxy to again become a man in the middle. Next slide. Fake charging stations are another interesting threat. I just recently returned from Singapore and flew in via Hong Kong, Hong Kong's international airport. What you see on the left side of the screen, I saw these all over the airport and I was rather shocked to see them. I'm used to seeing kiosks, but these are just Mac workstations. If you could imagine how many people might actually sit down to this, which is protected by Kaspersky, by the way, which I thought was somewhat interesting as well. But during civil unrest and protests, having people log in to Facebook from a public kiosk with exposed wires This is one of the scariest devices I've ever walked past, and you couldn't get me to log into it to save my life. You see things like this where there may be opportunistic rigs that people put in replacing cables, but there may be custom built solutions too, called a threat called juicejacking, where someone builds a custom station that looks like a simple power station. There's 4 pins on a USB, 2 are for data, 2 are for power, and you can assume that under that plastic, someone is only using it for power, but you really don't know, and you really can't trust whether that's in fact the case. And that's, I think, at the crux of what our USB threat looks like today. Next slide. Another source of information you might want to look at, because Honeywell is so ingrained in the industrial side of industrial cybersecurity and controls, and because USB is so important on OT networks, because they are, for the most part, air-gapped networks, USB is still a critical tool for doing updates on patches, whether they're OS patches or firmware patches or antivirus patches. Also configuration patches. We call them STIGs in the government, but a secure configuration update. All of those things, many of those things, are brought in through USB, and so you have to have a very secure method for transporting that. Honeywell uses something called a secure media gateway. Essentially, you would be plugging in a thumb drive in the lobby before it enters production, has it scanned, and make sure there's no malicious content on those devices, and then builds a secure index of those files on the systems then within the factory. Unless that USB is trusted and the files on it are trusted, they will not be able to execute. I see this as a trend that's likely to grow into other use cases, such as guest networks, and especially conference rooms where you have third parties coming in to give presentations. We still see people whipping out a USB right before a meeting and hoping somebody will plug it in, or the meeting is shot. So taking a look at that, but I mean, some scary stats coming out of their threat report. There's a link here if you're interested in the full report. It is free. But we are seeing, of the threats that they're blocking, 26% of those threats have the potential to cause major disruption to industrial controls. Next slide. So I'll close here, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A with the group. And I think these are 10 good practices that would apply equally to both small business and large enterprise alike. But let's start with number 1, eliminating the need for USB devices where possible. And I say the need because if we just go down the path of policy and saying, well, we're just going to ban USB and tell people not to do it, that doesn't eliminate the need. And that'll cause people to either go around the policy or just cause the policy to fail. We saw the DoD, in response to the USB threat back in 2008, do an across-the-board ban of USBs. It lasted 15 months. Some may argue that it might have done more harm than good because of those critical processes that I mentioned about applying patches and secure configuration guides and antivirus updates. Many of those downstream processes would break, even though the threat of portable malware was somewhat mitigated. So that lasted for 15 months, and they then reversed it. If you can eliminate the need and look for solutions that are in the cloud, I mean, there's so many ways now that you can securely transfer files. Encouraging employees to do that. Don't tell employees no, tell them how, right? Give them the right ways to securely do their job, and help them stay between those guardrails. The second one, again, things that anybody can do. You've probably got the ability to set global policy on your endpoints. Disabling auto run functionality is probably the number 1 thing you can do. For the most part, there's no reason that that any code should automatically run as soon as you put a device, an accessory into your computer. It should require some level of human consent or human interaction to allow that to occur. So looking for that ability to disable. Where you can, standardize on removable media. I've seen certain outfits switch from USB to SD card. SD card, assuming you've got an SD card reader built into your laptop that doesn't have a USB controller behind it, that would mitigate a lot of the malicious actions that could occur. It's not a hid controller under the hood. It's just a raw image like any other drive. So SD might be a solution for you. Number 4, blocking unregistered devices or classes from communicating with trusted endpoints. If you do have some endpoint protection solution, look to see how that endpoint solution might be able to help you with the USB threat as well, limiting it down to certain types or classes of actions. One thing I've seen people do is, instead of making removable media read, write, and execute, just making it read and write, and eliminating that ability to do execute. Number 5, using AV that is proficient in detecting variants. I'm somewhat partial to this topic. I'm a big fan of now looking at malware genetically as opposed to biometrically. I think all too many antivirus vendors today are looking for hashes and for signatures and behaviors that occur in sandboxes, but they're not looking at malware genetically. I think by being able to do that with advances in artificial intelligence, we can get much more efficacy on variants. And there's up to 100 million malware variants coming out each month. So this age-old practice of having signatures and updates is outdated. We've got to switch to genetic defense and do that through artificial intelligence. Number 6, I already mentioned how people are doing it inside OT environments, those secure media exchange gateways with both the device scanning in the lobby and human validation at the endpoint. I think that's likely to grow from the OT world into the IT world, so be on the lookout for those types of solutions as well. Number 7 is security awareness, or as Kirsten mentioned, it's more, I like to think of it more as culture than awareness. You know, awareness might be a seasonal activity, but culture is something you take with you every day. However you can get that message out to your employees regarding gifts, what to do with lost and found equipment. If people find USBs lying around, what are people expected to do with that? A lot of people will plug them into their laptop, trying to find the said owner of those devices, and that may be the very vector that bad guys are looking for. What are best practices about device charging? Should you be plugging your phone, your laptop into charging stations in airports? Possibly not. Should you be using device charging equipment that's handed out to you at conferences and trade shows? Probably not. And obviously, what the expectations are for DLP, for people that want to work from home. How are they expected to do so securely and to guard against a lost thumb drive that's full of highly sensitive payroll data? If you have to focus your security awareness, if you can't get to everybody, focus on your high value targets and your travelers. And I would also focus on the service owners, the people in IT that are ultimately responsible for building the guardrails into their services. Ideally, you want your security awareness to be fairly lightweight and allow the service to do much of the heavy lifting. Just have employees stay between the guardrails. USB condoms are now available. When you think of what I described, there's 4 pins inside a USB, 2 for data and 2 for power. The ability to create what's essentially a hardware firewall, so that that only those 2 pins used for power can be used, effectively neutering the data pins within those devices, are now something that you could buy and distribute to all employees. A fairly lightweight security awareness. Might raise a few eyebrows with the terminology, but that's sometimes good for awareness as well, making it more of a viral marketing play. Number 9, I would strongly recommend people support the revisions being made. If you take a look on usb.org, they are building new authentication standards and implementations into the USB standards so that we can validate that the device is what it says it is over USB. I think that's going to be increasingly important to fix the 23-year-old legacy of USB. And my final point will be post-infection due diligence. I see this all the time where people have antivirus and they get an infection and the AV company says it is quote unquote clean. What does clean really mean? And what should due diligence look like, whether it's a small business or a large, after you get an infection? I would venture to say you should be doing some sort of a 5 why analysis, asking why did this happen? And when you get that reason, well, why did that happen? Hopefully you can find the root cause and figure out what controls you need to change, whether those controls are policy or awareness or something technical you could do, or perhaps a new technology you can invest in. Figure out what those root causes are of infection. And don't assume that your antivirus companies are going to fix those root causes. They are clean. In my world, is not clean enough, and I think we need to go deeper than that. I think with that, I would open it up to the team for some Q&A and see what's on your mind.
So, Rich and Kirsten, thanks so much for that and your insights and update. We do have a couple of questions. Let me remind everybody, if you want to put a question in the question box or the chat box, we'll do our best to get to your questions. If not, we will make sure we get them included in the Q&A as part of the written summary. The first one is, Rich, while user awareness is vital, what recommendations do you have for specific tools or techniques to alert specific individuals when USBs or external storage devices are connected to a company system, so we can, trust but verify that they take actions?
Yeah, I can tell you how Honeywell does it. There's they wrote their own driver. It's called Trust, and it basically just inserts itself as a man in the middle. When a USB device is plugged in, Trust, and forgive me, I forget the acronym, but if you search for Honeywell Trust, you can find information on it. It'll tell you what this device really is. This is a keyboard, this is a mouse, this is a network device. Is this what you thought you were plugging in? It's a mass storage device. And if it's not, it gives you just another chance to know that that's malicious. Again, I think depending on what you have for an endpoint solution, I'm not going to advocate anyone in particular. CrowdStrike has a capability to do this as well, allows you to push the policies to say what's a trusted endpoint, what's a trusted device or trusted class of device. But all of those things are really policy. There's a lot of things you can do with global policy orchestration within the Microsoft world. But I think it starts, as Kirsten would say, with that policy category and having a policy that you can then apply through GPO.
Rich, we got a specific question about non-Windows operating systems. Same concerns for USBs?
Absolutely. I was a little surprised to see this. I felt maybe fat, dumb, and happy with my Mac, because I know that Mac has, at least in the recent versions of Mac OS, has eliminated the auto run functionality. But because of those same underlying hid risks, USB is still running while your machine is locked. Those things can be bypassed. So, unfortunately, I think we're in a state where the contemporary operating systems are still trusting the USB standard, and the underlying USB standard is insecure. So I think we need a bridge solution until USB is fixed with a technology that says we're only going to work with certain vendors of USB equipment or certain classes and capabilities of USB devices. That is, I know that's not an easy task for a small business, but perhaps what you can do is, if you're a really small business, you can just say, hey, we're only going to use this brand of USBs, and this is where you get them, and we're going to enforce this through a policy.
We got a question asking about, can you elaborate a little bit on security awareness training and how you might suggest going about it as it relates to, in general, security awareness training, but specifically around USB?
Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind. You know, I probably fell into this same trap as well, of trying to teach all employees the full depth and breadth of a security policy guide, and that just does not work. And it's probably a lazy way of doing security now that I think of it. I think the smart way for security awareness is to start with the service owners, the people, whether it's your messaging team, whether it's your desktop team, and make sure that security is built into those services, so that the need for employees is much more lightweight. Just stay between those guardrails, right? So I guess that would be my first advice is focus awareness on service owners. My second piece of advice, we did something called Design for Compliance. And the way we structured that, all employees were required to take the training. It was multi-day for the first year, and then an online 1-hour renewal thereafter. But the way we structured that was to really start by teaching employees to protect the things they cared about, to protect their identity, to protect their kids online, to protect their home router and their home network. And so it really got employees to lean into the security topic, because it became personal and it became something that they truly cared about. And then the switch was, once they cared about it, we asked them to bring those skills into the workplace and to protect their livelihood, which is ultimately the company they work for and the missions that they're supporting. And so I think that method really helped pull people in to the security topic by making it personal. The final thought I would have on that one is, security doesn't have to be scary. It's important to have an emotional connection, but that doesn't have to be one of fear. I'm not a paid spokesperson for restricted intelligence, but I love what they did for us at Honeywell. They basically make viral marketing style videos, kind of in the space of The Office sitcom show, about security topics. There was such a love for that show that employees would watch that and really absorb the messaging. It was a neat trick to use comedy as an emotional hook for security awareness. So I'd recommend that approach as well.
And Stuart, this is Kirsten. Just to build off of some of the things that Rich has said, I think companies have to look at this from a risk management approach. We're beyond the point of compliance checklist, but it's how do you manage your risk? And when you look at creating cultures, because I do think it's important there's always this reconciliation between moving security away from the end user and educating the end user, and both really need to be happening simultaneously. And one of the most effective ways to engage your workforce and to educate on some of the things that Rich was saying is to make it a part of onboarding. When you have an employee's greatest attention when they are starting a job and they're coming on and they're learning about the company, they're learning about their requirements, what's expected of them. And that's an ideal time to start looking at the education and the training. And building off of what Rich said, because I absolutely agree, and I think it's a great point around how you relate this to all parts of their life. So it's personal, and then it is brought into the professional piece. And you're starting to see so many more efforts underway that are trying to bring this human element. I saw actually a video yesterday, and it was about passwords. And they had a person dressed up as, quote, human error, and a person dressed up as sound judgment. And it was very entertaining, because it's essentially like the devil and the angel on either side of you. And so I think what you're starting to see is this recognition that we've got to do better in accessing people and getting them to understand this, because the technology reasons are not as important as the how. So it's not what we see with employees is they look for the investment. And to Rich's point, it's, how do you protect your family? How do you protect your livelihood? And oftentimes they don't need to know all of the technical reasons. They just need to know how. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to do it. And again, that's where onboarding, that's where HR plays a critical role. We talk a lot about positions in cybersecurity, what's required for this position and what's required for that. We tend to get bogged down in the technology side of companies and the IT and expect those areas to have the solutions. But we actually, as companies, have many more resources available to us beyond what resides in technology. And again, that's where HR can really come into play and have a very impactful and critical role.
Just one more thought. This is Rich. One more thought that occurs to me back on the security awareness topic. I think you probably also want to have a separate track for your high value targets. And you can define that a number of ways, but executives would certainly be heavily targeted. People with highly elevated privilege, your domain administrators, obviously, should go through specialized training. A high value target might include people that are frequent global travelers, or people that are responsible for maintaining critical systems, such as things on your factory floor. I think segmenting your market is important for security awareness. And not only giving them their annual or seasonal training, but really give them that just-in-time training as well. So if you can find ways to train people as something comes up, back to a comment made earlier, don't say no, say how. If security architects many solutions where the user experience is to be presented with a pop-up that's saying access denied or blocked. And I think we really need to do more human-centric design and security, that user experience that doesn't tell them no. It says, hey, you were trying to do it this way, and the right way to do it, or the right service to engage, is this. I think that eliminates a lot of the frustration and will cause less people to try to go around the controls that we've envisioned.
Rich, thank you very much for those additional comments. We do have a couple of poll questions that we will launch. We'll launch the first poll question. We provide an update to our leadership council and the CISOs that founded the organization on a regular basis on these polls. So we'd appreciate it if you could respond to them. Kirsten, we got a specific question for you that you can respond to while they're taking the poll. But it's, what are 3 things large enterprises can do from a people and process perspective to protect their ecosystem from USB-based attacks that may come from an SMB that might be in their supply chain?
So again, I think it sources back to education and understanding. So you've got to go to the cause. And I think the question is also about addressing the symptom. But it's really educating your employees early on around USBs, what they can do and what the policy should be, and having that policy. So having a policy, educating the employees, and then providing alternatives. And as I like what Rich said earlier around how do you eliminate the need for USBs? And so you want to be able to look at that. The actual, if something has been infected, there are technology solutions around that. And it's part of an incident response plan, because there are USB infection should be part of your incident response plan. And you need to assess the priorities and where it can impact your organization, so that in your preparation phase and in how you're becoming resilient, you ensure that you've created a block for the infection of those devices. But from a preventative perspective, again, it's establishing the policy, educating your employees, and defining alternatives for them that allow or prevent the workarounds.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for responding to the first poll question. We had 100% responded to the first question, so we very much appreciate that on the value that you found this today. We will launch the second question, and while we launch that, Rich, if you can respond to a question that says, what are the solutions to use to scan a USB to make sure it is clean?
That's interesting. I don't think a perfect solution exists. The types of solutions that are out there for scanning, we'll be looking at the file system itself. But it's possible for me to format a USB, completely wipe it, overwrite it, and to still have that USB infected, because the infection occurs at a layer the operating system can't see. It's firmware. So until we have better solutions in place that can actually look at that device at the USB protocol level and say whether that device is trusted, whether we can inspect firmware, I think we're in a place where we can never truly trust that something is clean. I think we have to push back to say we need a trusted supplier, and we need a trusted USB standard, and then only then can we build an agent that can inspect those trust relationships and make a decision. I wish I had a better answer.
Well, thank you very much. So 88% of the people said they learned something that they can immediately implement in their organization. So we appreciate everybody responding to that and responding to the poll in general. Kirsten, why don't we do this? If you want to make a couple of kind of closing remarks, and then we can turn it over to Rich to maybe give people a couple of things to think about immediately, and then we will wrap the session up at the top of the hour.
Thanks, Stuart. And again, thank you very much for your partnership and for the support of the Cybersecurity Collaborative in what we're trying to do with the Cyber Readiness Institute. The big piece that I will try to leave the listeners with is the importance in investing in your workforce as a means toward improving your security. Creating a culture of cyber readiness is so critical. Last week, we saw the Department of Homeland Security launch their initial tools and resources for small businesses. We're going to be working directly with them on that. And they talk about the culture of readiness, about identifying somebody within your organization. The ROI on technology is enhanced exponentially when every employee recognizes their role in security. And we don't need technology to support people, but we need people to be empowered by technology. And regardless of the size of a company, regardless of what you do, what the mission is, every company now has a role in some global value chain. And so every company needs to take on the responsibility, in the most effective way and the most long-term efficient way to do that is to truly invest in the individual and help them understand their role and their accountability and responsibility in security. So thanks again, Stuart, and thanks, Rich. I'll turn it over to you for your partnership in this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. One thing I learned on this call today about CRI in particular was, 1 million small businesses under the care of CRI is an amazing accomplishment. So congrats on that. That's really terrific work you guys are doing for helping out small business.
Thank you.
Something, I guess, in closing, something to think about, and maybe it's in the category of security awareness. I'm a huge fan of the book Made to Stick. There's a simple acronym that they used for how to do effective communications and awareness within your environment. It's called SUCCESS. Simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories. And so what does that mean? It means as a leader, you need to be a storyteller. I would recommend, if you were to have homework from this exercise, go find within your antivirus data repository, figure out the USB viruses that have been in your environment. If there's data loss examples or case studies in your environment, work those to ground as well. Ask the 5 whys, but build a story around it. That's going to make it personal to your senior leadership, perhaps make it personal to all employees, and hopefully motivate people to do more to address USB threats and to protect your enterprise. Stuart, thanks for the opportunity to chat. I think it was a great way for me to dust off what I've done with USB in the past and learned a few things in preparing for this. So appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you both. Rich, we very much appreciate your leadership on our Leadership Council, and Kirsten, our partnership in being a champion in your program is critically important, to us and to doing what we can to help the supply chains and the small and medium businesses, be smarter and be stronger. We talk about it as the next level of information, after your open source tools. I will say with the next two calls with a subject matter expert we have coming up, one will be on implementing a SOC that will take place in a couple of weeks. And then we will have one from Chuck Brooks, specifically on the next steps for implementing a NIST framework, as well as if you haven't started, what you ought to do at the beginning of the year to start to implement the NIST framework. So with that, we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for participating today. Thank you very much for responding to the poll questions. And we will have a written summary of today's session available to anyone off our website, and we'll provide that to CRI for them to distribute as well. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon and morning. Bye-bye.